I want to thank you for joining what promises to be a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. Pardon me. My name is Pat Rutledge, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Marco Island Historical Society, and we're your hosts this afternoon. Dr. J. Michael Butler will provide a compelling examination of Florida's role in the civil rights movement and the myth of Florida's exceptionalism. While many believe Florida avoided the racial turmoil experienced across the Deep South, this presentation reveals how the state experienced many of the same struggles, protests, and challenges that defined the Black freedom movement throughout the South, and how this history continues to shape America today. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Butler. He is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of History at Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. A specialist in Black freedom struggle, his work has appeared in leading journals, including the Journal of African American History and the Journal of Southern History. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1960 to 1980, won the 2017 Florida Book Award for Nonfiction. Named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians in 2024, Dr. Butler also served as a visiting professor at Yale University's Gilderlerman Center in fall of 2025. So we are delighted to have Dr. Butler with us today to share his expertise and help us better understand this important chapter of Florida's history. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. J. Michael Butler.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Patricia. It always is sort of an out-of-body experience when you hear things like that said about you, even though, as Muhammad Ali said, it ain't bragging if it's the truth, right? Um, I am passionate about sharing these stories and sharing these histories with a general population, with a group of non-academics, right? I love talking about these stories, particularly with people who aren't familiar with them. That's why we do what we do. So I am honored, thrilled, uh, and looking forward to the discussion. And thank you to Marco Island Historical Society for asking me to do this. So the name of the presentation today, and it's going to be mostly discussive. There will be some notes. There will be some specific quotes because that's the evidence that historians use to write these stories, right? But I want to have more of a conversation about the importance of these topics, right? I think to put us in the mindset, what I like to do is use the state of Florida as a prism to understand greater regional and national campaigns and national trends. What happens in Florida is not just relegated to our state. What happens in Florida both reflects national trends and informs national trends. And that's something that's really important. Okay. One of my favorite documentarians, Billy Corbin, often says that the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. And I think, in terms of understanding Florida's rich Black history, nothing could be farther from the truth, right? As a matter of fact, I think maybe the America of today is the Florida of yesterday for reasons that we'll discuss as we go. But the civil rights movement in Florida, I think that one of the first things that I need to do is to thank Florida Humanities for hosting and sponsoring this event. We are uh, not just obligated, but also honored to work in partnership with Florida Humanities in a time where it seems that the honest retelling of our past history is scrutinized more closely than ever. Some would even say maybe censored more than ever. It's important for us to recognize that Florida Humanities is a valued partner. Now, with that being said, as the slide says, funding was provided by Florida Humanities, but any of the views, conclusions, recommendations don't represent the organization as a whole. It's the age in which we live, right? So few American states encapsulate our national experience quite like Florida. That's one of the things this presentation is going to demonstrate. And as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, Florida Humanities is spending the year recognizing the spirit of our state. Central to this effort is the organization's longest running program, which is Florida Talks. This talk is a part of that greater program, bringing some of the Sunshine State's brightest minds to your community and me. I'm not one of the brightest, but I can pretend. This presentation will illuminate many facets of Florida's history, its layered past, its dynamic present, and unfolding future. And again, that's sort of the disclaimer. Thank you, Florida Humanities, for continuing to sponsor activities and programs like this one. So let's jump into the outside perception of Florida because this is where we have to start when we discuss Florida exceptionalism. How the state is often perceived, particularly by my students and in communities that I often speak, is that somehow Florida is not part of the Deep South. That you have Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina that are really central to understanding the civil rights movement, but Florida's somehow different. Florida is a trap for tourists and vacationers, retirees, right? You've heard the jokes probably as I have when I came to Florida. Oh, you're going to God's waiting room. I've been in Florida 18 years now, so maybe it's true. It's just an extended waiting period for me. We've got NASA. We have the state capital, which is in a really weird part of Florida, in Tallahassee, which, by the way, was put in between Pensacola and St. Augustine, the two dominant cities in Florida at the time of statehood. We've got the Mouse in Orlando. We have Miami, which is sort of the gateway to Latin America. So, this idea of Florida is that somehow Florida is not like the rest of the South, that race relations here were different, if not better, that Florida might be like the rest of the nation in terms of race relations, but definitely not part of the South. This is what we often call in the Academy of Florida exceptionalism. Florida is south of the Mason-Dixon line, but it's not really part of the South. One of the things that I want this lecture to challenge is that instead of being seen as somehow outside of our nation's civil rights movement, that instead we place Florida at the center of the way that we understand our nation's Black freedom struggle. These are some of the postcards that I use as evidence to reinforce that Florida, no, is part of the Deep South. That African Americans have been portrayed in literature, in tourist literature, in postcards, in ways that they are portrayed in many other Deep South states. There is this Old South antebellum nostalgia that exists in some parts of Florida, whether it's South Florida, if you look at the postcard on the right, which demonstrates that Black people are seen as less than human, maybe as a token of ridicule, humor. We see that that postcard coming from the Miami area is titled A Darky's Prayer, right? Or we see on the left a postcard from St. Augustine, my hometown, where we have the throwback of an African American gentleman with a cane standing in front of the aforementioned slave market. All right. This throwback to outside nostalgia of Deep South days in which things maybe were a little better then. So even looking at some of our tourist advertisement paraphernalia, we understand that no, race relations in Florida mirrored, not differed from, the way that they existed throughout the rest of the South, and I would contend in much of a nation, even in St. Petersburg's alligator farm, in fans that are sold. We have African American youngsters who are referred to as alligator bait. This is a dehumanization. This is a reminder that white supremacy characterized the state in that Black people are seen as inherently inferior. So those are some images that I want to start with, that I often start this lecture with to remind us that Florida is not outside of the Deep South when it comes to race relations, as a matter of fact. It's central to understanding that. I often remind students that Florida was the third state to secede the Union, the third state to secede from the Union, right? After South Carolina and a day after Mississippi. So, if you put it in that context, Florida is a place where we can look to understand not just the end of the 19th century, but throughout the 20th century and into the 21st when it comes to understanding race relations. Now, my argument is that there are four reasons that Florida should be placed at the center of our nation's civil rights history. Okay. So if you're taking notes and if you were a student in my class, I might encourage you to write this down. Four reasons that Florida should be at the center of the way we understand the civil rights movement, starting with the amount, both in quantity and degree, of racial violence that characterized the state. Now, for the purposes of this lecture, I'm actually starting in 1920. But one thing that's important to remember is that one of the biggest blights on our nation's past, lynching, the golden age of lynching, if it can be called such, really existed from 1890 to 1945, right? That last decade of the 19th century into the post-World War II era. Well, between those years, between 1890 and 1945, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings. Florida was more dangerous for a black person to live than Mississippi, Alabama, or Georgia. So when you understand that stat, you start sort of peeling back the layers to the types, the degrees, and the quantity of racial violence that characterize the state. Now, there are a lot of reasons for it. And as I go through some of these examples, you'll see that there is no one form of racial violence that characterized the state, but in fact, it was many. And it reflected and informed greater regional patterns and even national patterns. Look at no further than 1920, Ocoee, a presidential election, a contested presidential election in which fears, stop me if you've heard this before, but fear of electoral manipulation by outsiders was spreading throughout the South in the lead up to this important national presidential election. Well, Ocoee, Florida, in the middle of the state, Orange County. Orange County? Yeah, Seminole, Orange, in that area. Lake County. Ocoee was a place where an African American who had accumulated a tremendous amount of wealth and owned land, owned his own business, appeared to vote, and he was met by a group of armed men. So, what does he do as an American citizen? He exercised his First Amendment rights, returned to vote with his gun in check, with backup. Firefight broke out. Klansmen arrived from nearby Orlando. And what happened as a result of this dispute over who was allowed to vote, the violence that was used to try to prevent them from voting, is that white vigilantes entered the segregated area of Ocoee, and burned everything. It lasted several days, several nights. What we know is that there are 56 documented deaths, probably more. But because of electoral violence over an African American's constitutionally given right to cast a ballot, the black residential area in Ocoee disappeared within a week. We didn't learn about this until the 1990s. And now in Ocoee, there is that monument to hallowed ground to the memory of those who once called that section of town its home. 1923, Rosewood. It's one of the most infamous instances of racial violence that our state produced. One of the reasons that I point out these examples that I do is that each is different. Each kind of gives a different twist to stories and to patterns that are replicated throughout the South. In Rosewood, African Americans played the Booker T. Washington game. And what I mean by that is that they self-segregated. They saved their money. They invested in properties. They invested in businesses that were away from the white residential area. They catered to a black audience. They didn't try to integrate, and it didn't matter because in 1923, working class white resentment of African Americans exploded, and it exploded in a way that racial violence throughout the South often exploded. A white woman accused a black man of attempted rape. There's no evidence that this happened. This is a common refrain throughout not just Florida's history or the South's history, but American history. An inflamed community, white violence triggered by accusations of black male sexual violation. It started in early 1923, a riot that left 6 African Americans dead, up to 150 killed. And again, the memory of Rosewood literally disappeared from the historical record until the end of the 1970s because the African Americans who survived the Rosewood Massacre, as it's now called, left the area, relocated up north, and never tried to challenge until 40, 50 years later, never tried to challenge the repossession of the land that belonged to them. 1934, one of the last quote unquote spectacle lynchings of the Jim Crow era occurred in Marianna, Florida. A man by the name of Claude Neal. Again, there are a lot of, a lynching doesn't happen in a cultural or political vacuum, right? There's a lot of resentment, tensions, hostilities that are going on in a community. And then the accusation, as Claude Neal received, of killing and raping a young white girl, as you know, the St. Petersburg Times headline indicates, led to Claude Neal being seized by a Florida mob. This was after he was arrested and held in a jail just across the Alabama line. Was he taken there for his own protection, or was he taken there for a lynch mob to gather? The latter, actually. And this is one of the most gruesome cases of a spectacle lynching that you'll ever read. Hundreds of people gathered. The torture was ritualistic. A confession was sought. There was mutilation. There was torture. There was finally a killing. He was drugged. His body was drugged through the black community. And it was strung up on a tree in front of the courthouse. It precipitated dozens of armed whites going into the black community, setting fire to homes, shooting into houses, beating innocent people. This is Jim Crow justice in the South during this time, and Florida actually reflected those trends. It's not immune from it. 1948, Groveland. Once again, if you want to read a single work on this topic, Devil in the Grove by Gilbert King is tremendous. And it tells the story of the Groveland Four, which eventually became the Groveland Three. And it has all the makings of a Southern Gothic horror 1940s post-World War II era story of tragedy and injustice. Again, 4 African Americans charged of raping a white woman. No evidence to support a very questionable case, shall we say. The NAACP gets involved, sends a new representative of its up and coming legal defense fund division, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall, to defend the Groveland Four. They are moved to the state prison. They are returned to Lake County. And during this return, a sheriff straight out of central casting named Willis McCall, who was absolutely brutal and ruled his county with an iron white supremacist fist, stopped the car, told the boys to get out, and shot 2. One survived and told the story that really became the basis for Devil in the Grove. A tragic tale of Jim Crow injustice, all of which happened, you would think if you removed all of the settings and you put it into a cotton plantation area instead of a citrus plantation area, that it would be Mississippi or maybe Alabama. But it actually occurred here in the post-World War II era. Harry T. Moore. If we talk about the martyrs of the civil rights movement, we often think about Dr. King in 1968. Maybe we think of Medgar Evers in Mississippi in 1964, but very rarely do people know the name Harry T. Moore or understand his significance in terms of understanding American history and the Black freedom struggle in the South. You see, Harry T. Moore was a teacher, he was an educator. He filed the first successful, semi successful teacher equalization pay lawsuit in America, in Mims, Florida, in the 1940s. He became a leader of a new organization that had established a foothold in Florida during that time as the aforementioned NAACP, where he investigated the Groveland killings. And most importantly, he put together one of the NAACP's first major voter registration campaigns. Now, the voter registration campaign focused on rural areas in the South. It was very, very dangerous. Harry T. Moore became a marked man by the Central Florida Klan, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And ultimately, his activism and his work for the basic constitutional rights of making sure that Black employees in the public sector were paid equally and they were allowed to register and cast their ballots equally cost him and his wife their life. Christmas night, 1951, you can see the photograph on the right. A bomb was placed under Harry T. Moore's home, the explosion of which was heard from 12 miles away, killing him and his wife Harriet for the work that they had done, working under the auspices of the NAACP. Harry T. Moore became the first NAACP member killed in the line of duty, the first state official, I should say, not the first member. He was the first state official killed in the line of duty for the work he did for equal rights. He is, then, in some ways, the NAACP's first civil rights martyr. Get into the 1960s. This is where we see events happen in Florida that mirror greater national events and programs, right? February 1st, 1960, we have the famous photograph of the Greensboro Four, the North Carolina A&T students who enter a Woolsworth. And by simply not obeying a discriminatory law, by sitting at a lunch counter and demanding equal service as white customers, they violated an integration ordinance and started a nonviolent revolution throughout the South. The way that we're often taught that story is that nonviolence triumphed immediately and we all lived happily ever after. We don't often ask ourselves, well, what happened in places where violence actually won? Look no further than Jacksonville, Florida. In the spring of 1960, downtown establishments were targeted for integration by a local group of young people who followed the Greensboro model. They announced to police, which was one of the tactics, you let police know of the demonstrations that you were going to conduct so that they would be there to protect you. Well, what happens if the police are in cahoots with the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists? Well, we see the result in Jacksonville in 1960 being Axe Handle Saturday. In Axe Handle Saturday, the police actually let local vigilante groups know that the sit-ins were coming. So men waited and they had axe handles and baseball bats and bicycle chains in their cars. So when the young people tried to enter Jacksonville department stores, they were beaten with violence. And then the people who were beaten were arrested for starting the riot. Jacksonville restaurants, the downtown areas, do not integrate for months. And what we see from a Florida example is that the nonviolent revolution is actually paid for in blood. And it did not always succeed immediately. People literally took their lives in their hands to experience the full citizenship rights that the Constitution provided all. It's not always a happy story. One of the things that we see as characterizing Florida is the growth of the second Ku Klux Klan. right? The post-Reconstruction, the post-1920s Klan, even in terms of as the civil rights movement began nationally, as Brown versus Board of Education became law, as Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock is targeted, white people fight back. They unite. They form organizations to quote unquote protect the white race, to protect our heritage, to protect our culture. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. This is a Ku Klux Klan recruitment ceremony that was held in northern Florida, Callahan. It's not too far from Jacksonville, not far from the Georgia line in 1956. Seems like this were replicated throughout Florida to the degree that one of the historians on the Klan in America has concluded that in the 1950s and 1960s, one of the largest and most effective states for Klan activity was Florida. Thousands of white men joined this organization. And in Florida, it was really impactful because these Klan units were not centralized. There was no state Klan. They were regional because Florida is such a big state, as y'all know. I mean, the general piece of trivia that's used to illustrate this is that, once upon a time, maybe a little faster now because of interstates, but if you traveled state roads from Miami to Pensacola, it's actually quicker to drive from Pensacola to Chicago. That's how big Florida is, right? You put it in those terms. And Florida is broken down by so many different regions with so many different sorts of industries, with so many different sorts of businesses, with so many sorts of trades that exist there, that there was no real organized one KKK. There are dozens of Klan units that operated in different sections of Florida. It was harder for state and federal governments to infiltrate and break up those groups. So we see that the Klan in Florida becomes the largest and most effective of all the state Klan units that existed in the South at the height of the civil rights movement. Violence then in organized vigilante fashion. St. Augustine, 1964. I could give and have given a whole presentation just on this topic. St. Augustine in 1964 was the only state SCLC campaign organized in Florida. Dr. King, because of tourism, because St. Augustine was set to celebrate its quadricentennial, the first longest continuously inhabited European city in continental United States today is St. Augustine. It's the first city to celebrate its 400th. That was in 1965. To protest the federal government's contributing of money to celebrate segregation, basically. SCLC, in large part because the Civil Rights Act was going through Congress and Dr. King wanted to keep the nation's attention focused on racism that existed in the nation's oldest city, chose St. Augustine as a place to carry out a national campaign. We get one of the most infamous and iconic images from the 1964 St. Augustine campaign, the photograph in your bottom right of James Brock pouring muriatic acid into a swimming pool that black teenagers had gotten into at his establishment. The very next day in Washington, D.C., Congress voted to make the Civil Rights Act law, and that photograph was on the front page of Washington papers when the vote was held. Florida then both reflected and influenced national events in 1964. And so it goes. One of the things about the Florida movement that I think is really important is that it stretches our understanding of the civil rights movement's chronology. And I think this is important. Usually when we think of the civil rights movement, we think of maybe 1954, 55 as being the beginning, Brown versus Board or the Montgomery bus boycott. And we think that it ends in 1968, but it doesn't. Understanding the civil rights movement in Florida stretches our understanding of the movement because we began in 1920 and could have began a lot earlier. The civil rights movement doesn't begin in 54 and it doesn't end in 68. We have a Republican convention that's scheduled for Miami that is boycotted by African Americans who want the Republican Party to include them more. The Miami police and ultimately the state National Guard is sent in to get these protesters out of the downtown area for the sake of the convention. A riot breaks out, and it indicates that issues of housing, that issues of employment, that issues of Black participation in the Republican Party are going to remain issues going into the 1970s, and it does. In 1968 in Miami, 3 protesters are killed by the Miami police. 800 members of the Florida National Guard are called out, all of which occurred during the Republican National Convention. Fast forward to 1975. I hate to plug my book, but I will. Pensacola, Florida, Escambia County in the Panhandle. I literally wrote the book on this struggle. And it centered in 1975 around 2 issues that remained problems into the 21st century. The presence of Confederate images in public schools, which we see at the bottom, and the shooting of an unarmed motorist by a county sheriff. Both of these events galvanized a local movement that had kind of gone dormant. As a matter of fact, the Pensacola movement demonstrates that during the 1960s, some communities are uneasy with integration, but it happens with little violence. But in the 1970s, all hell broke loose. The Pensacola story is indicative of that. But again, what we see is that in looking at race relations in Florida, the movement doesn't end. It just continues to evolve and shift into different things. We've got in 1980, 84, and 89, racially motivated riots that occurred in Miami. The Arthur McDuffie riot, uh, Army veteran, a military veteran, and a cyclist who was killed by police, who a jury of all white men found the officers not guilty. Starts racial unrest in Miami that's going to surface later. In 2012, we have an international incident of a young man named Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, who's wearing a hoodie and is shot by a vigilante in his own neighborhood for protection. It starts a national reckoning over the targeting of young Black men who were quote unquote perceived as threats. So the racial violence indicates that Florida is a place to start our understanding of the civil rights movement, its timeline, its conflicts, the many forms that racial violence takes, and the chronology that indicates that the struggle for racial justice has been ongoing in this state and continues to this day. But that's just one reason that I think Florida should be at the center of the way we understand the nation's civil rights movement. Another reason is because of the urban and rural divide that exists in Florida. I think Florida provides so many different interesting case studies of how the struggle for racial equality occurred in places that were more rural and those that were more urban. Historians tend to kind of break those down, right? In the academy, when scholars look at Mississippi, it's primarily rural. And the way to understand the Mississippi movement is understanding it through the prism of rural organization and mobilization. Whereas other scholars look at urban places like Birmingham or Atlanta, Nashville, New Orleans, Charlotte, and they try to examine the elements there that help us understand how the fight for racial equality occurred in places that had more commercial pressures, right? In Florida, we've got both. In Florida, we have a very sizable rural population. As a matter of fact, the majority of Floridians today still earn their incomes from agriculture. Okay? So we're not far removed from that. And in this area, in the areas of citrus and turpentine and railroad building, and hotel building. We have systems that develop which are not unique to Florida per se, but are perfected in Florida, like bottom left, convict leasing. The criminal justice system is informed by racial division and the need for cheap labor in the aftermath of the era of emancipation. So states would pass laws that were very, very restrictive on crimes that they considered to be more committed by black men, particularly vagrancy. Okay? You had to have a job. If you didn't have a job, you could be arrested for vagrancy. Uh-oh, Patricia, I see your hand up. Yes. Feel free to jump in, Patricia, if there's something here that I need to know.
Actually, it was not me. Unfortunately, I hit the button as well, but there was someone else, David Capel, who raised his hand.
Yes.
David, would you like to put your question in chat?
I tell you what, I think the way that that we'll do this is put if the audience has questions during the presentation, put it in the chat. And Patricia, when the lecture is over, why don't we go through those questions first?
Perfect. Sounds like a plan. Oh,
Excellent.
David's coming back saying it was an error.
Oh, okay. Well, gosh, I'm sorry about that. I was hoping that there were some good questions coming out of this
I'm
already,
sure there will.
but we'll see, right? But yeah, not only do we have the rural divide with Florida agriculture, but there's still a demand for cheap labor, right? And you see that happening after emancipation. It's one of the problems with the white mentality after emancipation is that we lost this unfree permanent workforce. How do we recount for that? How do we make amends for that? And one of the ways that it happened at the state level was vagrancy laws were passed, black behavior was criminalized, heavy fines are imposed, and when the fines couldn't be paid, the men were incarcerated. Well, what happens in Florida is that laws are passed which establishes a convict lease system, which basically meant that if a white business owner, if a landowner, if a plantation owner in the middle of the citrus groves in southern Florida can pay the fines of black convicts, then they would have to serve out the remainder of their time working off that debt to the person who paid their fine. So all of a sudden, you have laws that are very restrictive, that have that have fines that black families can't pay, that now plantation owners can pay, and they've got a semi-permanent, semi-free workforce with very few rights. That's convict leasing. In places where tourism dominated, you see in the bottom right, this is actually from Northeast Florida, where wait-ins are used. Beaches are segregated. Now, how you segregate an ocean is always one of the things that's really difficult for college students to understand. How do you segregate? Does this go all the way to Europe? What's the mindset here? And one of the things that I often say is if you try to understand white supremacy from a logical standpoint, it's going to drive you crazy because it's illogical, right? But these campaigns were done in tourist-driven areas for these images to be captured so that it would discourage tourism, right? This idea that white supremacists control the ocean and the beaches and the rivers and the state parks. This is a tactic that's used and circulated throughout the North to let people know that they're not wanted here, to save your tourism dollars and go somewhere else. And it was an effective tactic. So, the second reason that I think Florida is a great place to examine when we look at race relations in the South is because of this emphasis on understanding the way that Black freedom was accomplished and the challenges that are faced in places that are primarily rural and primarily urban. Ah, the political approach. This is the third reason, the political approach. the way that states' rights was used as a defense of segregation and not outright massive resistance. Okay, so a couple of terms here. In the aftermath of Brown versus Board in 1954, Brown versus Board, NAACP President Roy Wilkins called Brown v. Board a second Emancipation Proclamation. And the reason that he called it that was because when schools integrate, everything else was going to follow. And you're hitting the next generation of American citizens who are going to come of age in an atmosphere with people who are not like them. I don't want to use the D word, but I think diversity was one of the things that the NAACP actually wanted, because if you're around people who aren't like you culturally, racially, politically, all of a sudden you find out that you have things in common with them and they become more human. Well, in Florida, there is a conscious approach to how the state can fight integration. And it was through the defense of states' rights, through a process of delay, stonewalling with courts, and tokenism. Now, what we see in Florida, and it gets a little more academic, it gets a little more complex here, but what we see as a result to Florida's political approach to defending states' rights is that we see desegregation occur in the state in a relatively quote unquote peaceful way, but we don't see true integration occur. Okay. Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, we can go back even before this. If we want to look at Florida's approach to using state laws, to using the court systems, to using the state constitutions to keep whites and blacks separate. We can go all the way back to we can go back to the first Reconstruction era Constitution in Florida history, but go back to the 1885 Constitution. In 1885, Florida wrote a new Constitution, and it was the first state in the Union. Florida is the first state in the Union to implement a poll tax, a tax that had to be paid in order to get the right to vote. Florida was the first state to segregate schools by law, not by practice. And when Brown versus Board came out, the Attorney General of Florida developed the political and legal strategy to delay implementation. Now, remember, I said that one of the things that Florida teaches us is the importance of delay, tokenism, and stonewalling. The state's response to Brown is a great example of that. Because what Richard Irvin, the state attorney general in Florida at the time, said was that Florida is not going to use quote unquote massive resistance. In other words, massive resistance is seen in places like Mississippi, in Georgia, in Alabama. Think George Wallace, Ross Barnett, right? This idea that a governor will say, we are not going to integrate and we will do everything possible short of violence to prevent it when violence actually occurs. Okay. That draws national attention. It draws international ridicule. It draws federal intervention. So Florida's attorney general knew this. So what he proposed, and it became the basis of Brown 2, is that Florida would ask for an indefinite timeline. Brown said that schools had to integrate, but it didn't say when. It was in Florida that the concept of all deliberate speed was developed, and it became the basis of Brown 2. So, in other words, Brown 2, which was passed in 1955, declared by the Supreme Court in 1955, basically said that school districts had an indefinite time to integrate schools. In other words, with all deliberate speed. Florida stonewalled even more with the creation of the People Assignment Law in 1956. Now, what the People Assignment Law does, remember, Florida has 67 counties. The political approach is instead of having a state board of education that determines one integration plan for all 67 counties, what the People Assignment Law will do is demand that each county develop their own integration program. Then, if students or their parents sue that system sue that district, they have to go through the county, then the state. It draws out the process of integration. It makes it more expensive. Delay, delay, delay. I'm going to give you what the wording of the pupil assignment law says. Okay. Just to give you an indication of how difficult it was for Black parents to apply for their children to go to integrated schools. What the pupil assignment law said is that yes, every county got to develop their own integration plan. But the county had to consider, quote, the sociological, psychological, and other social scientific factors as will prevent socioeconomic class consciousness among pupils in determining student assignment. Boards had to consider, quote, the scholastic aptitude, intelligence, mental energy, and ability of the pupil. So it gave every county multiple reasons to make the process as difficult as possible. And in the process, for parents who applied, maybe one or two would be admitted. And the pressure that was put on those families was intense. So that the state could say, if the federal government intervenes, and they do, we have integration. We have accepted, for instance, in 1961, in Orchardville Elementary School in Miami, we've accepted a small number of Black children. Our district is therefore integrated. It worked. And it delayed it to the point that by 1966, 90% of Florida students went to segregated schools. Let me repeat that. In 1966, 90% students in Florida's public schools went to segregated academies. That's unbelievable. And it's one of the reasons that a federal busing program was pursued, was the example that Florida set of how meaningful integration could be avoided. You know, I'm not going to get into him too much because we're running low on time. But the governor, the poster boy for Southern moderation during the civil rights movement is Florida Governor Leroy Collins. And Leroy Collins was governor in the late 1950s, before 1960, and he was moderate. His emphasis was on marketing Florida as a place for investment, a place for vacation. He is the person who really made Florida what it is now. And you see this um, on the cover of Time magazine with industry, with leisure, with agriculture, with citrus, right? Now, in his latter political years, he is appointed to be on a federal human relations commission. Okay. And he really brandished this image as a racial moderate, particularly at the federal level. So he's often portrayed in Florida and remembered as a progressive white Southern governor in a time of racial conservatism. Um, Nothing could be farther from the truth because of the way he defended segregation. He defended segregation by saying it was law. And above all else, Florida would maintain its allegiance to law and order, that it was legal. And because it was legal, it had to be defended. White supremacy and segregation had to be defended. He blamed the NAACP in the aftermath of Brown of quote unquote forcing the issue of integration. He said that Brown was a cruel hoax on the people of Florida, that Florida was just as determined as any other southern state to maintain segregation. Now, he's often cited in March of 1960 for being the first Southern politician. March of 1960, it's early, right? It's in the shadow of the sit-ins, where he is the first Southern governor to say, I represent all Floridians, whether they're white or black, whether that person is rich or poor, or influential or not influential. And he was lauded for that. But the context that's often missing is that 1960 was a lame duck year for Leroy Collins. 1960, he could not run for election again due to Florida's electoral laws. So, in other words, he was thinking about legacy and doing very little to change the racial atmosphere for all citizens equally. Yet, by comparison, again, the political approach, law and order, states' rights, Stonewall, tokenism, delay, Florida ends up looking more moderate than George Wallace in Alabama does later. One of the stats that I use to demonstrate how Florida politically is a prism through which we can understand national political developments, particularly when it comes to the impact of the civil rights movement, is look at 1968 with the presidential election then. In 1968, Richard Nixon was the Republican nominee. George Wallace was an independent. In 1968 in Florida, Nixon, the Republican, Wallace, the independent, received 70.5% of the popular vote. Nixon and Wallace in 1968, in a state that had previously been Democratic, Nixon and Wallace get 70.5% of the popular vote. I can't think of 70.5% of Floridians that agree on anything today. But what we see is a nationwide shift from white Southerners out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party is a large result to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and being passed in 1965. In 1972, George Wallace ran for president under the Democratic ticket. So did George McGovern. But George Wallace won every county in Florida, every Democratic county in Florida. Finally, the fourth thing that I want to point out is we can't end the conversation on necessarily a down note, right? Yeah, we've talked about violence and we've talked about understanding rural and urban dynamics and we've talked about politics. But one of the things that I want to point out is that understanding African American history and studying the civil rights movement reveals what is the best of us, in my opinion, as American citizens. We have people who are discriminated against unconstitutionally, who use the system and use mobilization and activism as a way to change and reform the system nonviolently, using the vote, using the call to a public's conscience, using legal measures to gain equality for all. We've got Harry T. Moore, bottom left. I've already talked about him. The Progressive Voters League, Florida's civil rights martyr. We have the Miami NAACP that fought the Johns Committee all the way to the United States Supreme Court. More on that, in other readings. We have, before the Montgomery bus boycott has even ended, guys, in Alabama, we have a co-founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference named Charles Kinsey Steele, the bottom right. C.K. Steele, Reverend C.K. Steele, actually begins a bus boycott in Tallahassee before the bus boycott in Montgomery is even finished. We have the first interracial institute held in Miami by a group called the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. They organized sit-ins in Miami 6 months before they occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina. We've got in Tallahassee, Florida A&M students who were the first to use a tactic that they called jail no bail. In other words, a tactic that later becomes used throughout the South of young Black people who decide instead of getting bailed out of jail, they're going to fill the jails to capacity and make city leaders negotiate integrated facilities. We've got, as a result of what happens in Pensacola, ministers who unite a community and hold police accountable and actually force Confederate symbols and nicknames out of the city's largest public high school. Mary McLeod Bethune, great educator, an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt's informal quote unquote colored cabinet. We've got Dr. King, Robert Hayling. We have theater, downtown integration in Tampa. In other words, wherever you are in Florida, you can always ask a simple question to unlock your city's rich history. How did integration occur here? And you're going to see local people at the grassroots level who organize and mobilize for change that sometimes bring national attention. You know, Martin Luther King doesn't parachute into St. Augustine and say he's going to change things for the better. He's asked to come to the city by a local dentist who was nearly himself lynched and financially ruined, right? So we see examples throughout Florida of local people who sometimes risk their lives to make the country live up to the promises it's made to all citizens equally. But maybe more importantly, we see in understanding Florida history how, to quote William Faulkner, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. The relevance of history and understanding contemporary events, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, it's inescapable that the political debates of today often have echoes of history ringing in the not too distant background, where we have public officials who don't understand why their nomination as or their election as a public official is problematic when they have posed in Klan uniforms, and a governor who resisted removing them because he just didn't see the big deal. That matters if you know the history. Vigilantism, the Proud Boys in South Florida, originated from South Florida. They're now a national group. They emerge out of the hate groups of the 1950s and 1960s that were most successful in this state. Hateful symbols like swastikas and Confederate flags. You know, I know the accent probably gives it away, but I'm actually from the South, right? I'm from LA, Lower Alabama. So when I talk to people about their heritage, question I often ask is, which heritage are you referring to? Symbols have meaning because they have been used for deliberate purposes. And Confederate flags and Nazi symbols have been used as symbols of racial hate. That's not saying that everyone who uses those symbols is a racist, but it is saying that the symbols that they use have a very clear racist path. We have education sometimes that is presented as indoctrination, and history that makes us feel a certain way is somehow woke and should be prohibited from public schools. I kind of have been caught in that trap because in 2022, a seminar that I gave for teachers on the long civil rights movement, that was the title, the long civil rights movement. It was actually canceled by the Osceola School Board because of fear that somehow teaching the civil rights movement meant that I brought critical race theory into our public schools. I didn't know that CRT meant civil rights training, but I guess it does. There's some of the national backlash over it. So for these reasons, understanding the civil rights movement in Florida reinforces why it should be at the center of the way we understand our civil rights struggle as a nation, not at the periphery, that Florida is not somehow exceptional in understanding our nation's past, but that it should be foregrounded in the way we understand these stories. I always try to leave students at the end of a lecture with, what are things that we need to take away? What is the importance? I think one of the things that is most important here is that understanding the Florida movement gives us a way to understand how developments in this state have both reflected and influenced greater national trends. And most importantly, that desegregation is not integration. There's a difference between the two. And the more that we understand this rich civil rights history in our state, the more we can fully understand why things like education, honest education, the vote, the Constitution means to all citizens equally, always have and always will. Thank you so